Good afternoon, and welcome to the fourth of our conversations in our Appalachian Studies Summer Authors Series. My name is Susan Poole, and I'm the Director of the College for Seniors here. For those of you who are with us for the first time, this series of talks has been made possible by a $100,000 endowment from the Bernard Osher Foundation. This grant, along with a $2 million endowment from the foundation, will allow us to invest in new programming and new directions for the center, purchase state-of-the-art audiovisual equipment for our classrooms, and join 120 other Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes, or OLLIs, across the country, dedicated to learning for the love of it. And if you are new to the center, please, I invite you to come back during our working hours when one of our staff can show you around our wonderful facility. We're extremely proud of our programming here at the center. We are in our 24th year, and I like to think that after that period of time, we do things pretty well. We offer life transitions programs for those who may be undergoing a change in their life status, Leadership Asheville Seniors, which introduces participants to the movers and shakers of Asheville, and College for Seniors, our lifelong learning program where people can learn everything from the literary works of Virginia Woolf to self-defense for older adults. Our fall catalog will go online August the 3rd, where you can learn more about us, and registration for our fall College for Seniors courses begins August the 14th. And if you're interested in the 97 courses that we will be offering in the College for Seniors in the fall, we have posters both downstairs in the atrium and upstairs outside our office. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for this evening, or this afternoon, I should say. Tom Rash received a BA from UNC Chapel Hill in English education and a master's from Clemson University in English. He was an instructor in English at Clemson for 3 years. Tom has lived in Asheville since 1989 and has worked at Asheville Buncombe Technical Community College since the same year in adult education. A freelance editor and essayist, he's also working on a documentary film on Thomas Wolfe's Lacombe Angel. Tom is also leading a campaign to save the cabin that Thomas Wolfe lived in on his last visit to Asheville. Ron Rash, who coincidentally shares the same last name as Tom, is the author of the 2009 PEN/Faulkner finalist and New York Times best-selling novel Serena, in addition to 3 other prize-winning novels, One Foot in Eden, Saints at the River, and The World Made Straight. He also authored 3 collections of poems and 4 collections of stories, among them Burning Bright, which won the 2010 Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award, and Chemistry and Other Stories, which was a finalist for the 2007 PEN/Faulkner Award. His latest novel, The Cove, is set in North Carolina mountains near Mars Hill at the height of World War I. Twice the recipient of the O. Henry Prize, he teaches at Western Carolina University. If you would please, we'll follow the same format that we have in our other 3 series. If you would hold your questions until after the authors have finished speaking, then I'm sure that they will be glad to answer your questions. Please help me welcome Tom and Ron Rash.
I'd just like to let you know, first of all, that Ron's a little nervous because of I've sort of structured this, and he doesn't know exactly what all I'm going to be asking. So, the first thing, 2 things. One, what I'm trying to do today is show that he's known as an Appalachian writer, very well known as an Appalachian writer, but I also wanted to sort of show that he's a small town writer also. We're from Boiling Springs, North Carolina, and that's a small southern town. Fairly rural. There was a college in that town, and so I wanted to emphasize that. And the other thing I wanted to emphasize is that he is not completely, as he has been called, implacably grim. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
The reason about
Hello. Is that on? No. All right. So the first thing I wanted to do, ask Ron, before we get going in the formal program, is we've lost 3 people in the last year who were associated with North Carolina. Doc Watson, Earl Scruggs, and Andy Griffith. And I thought I might have Ron comment a little bit about what those individuals meant to him and to the state.
I think growing up Southern Baptist, you have one Trinity, but Earl and Doc and Andy were the other. Earl Scruggs actually grew up in Boiling Springs, and Tom and I both worked for him. Worked for his brother at the college, doing maintenance work. And Earl would come back occasionally and play concerts. So I got to see him several times playing with his brother, in Boiling Springs. That was really wonderful. Doc Watson, I've never quite pinned this down, but have you noticed how famous people have more cousins than other people? Some convoluted way, we're kin to Doc Watson, we certainly claim him. And actually, I guess it was, 2 years ago when our mother went to a funeral up in Watauga County for one of our relatives, and Doc played at the funeral. He just got up there with his guitar. And Andy Griffith, of course, just a great actor, and I think we don't tend to think of Andy Griffith. I think he's underappreciated as an actor, but anybody who's seen a face in the crowd knows that he had a really wide range of talent. So we lost 3 of the best.
So today we're going to try to be a little lighter and show another side of Ron Rash. And we'll open up with a short passage from Notes from Beyond the Pale.
Yeah. Is this okay? I mean, are y'all hearing me okay? I'm getting a little bit of feedback, but it's okay? Okay. Yeah, this is a story called Notes from Beyond the Pale. And my first book was obviously based on Boiling Springs. Anybody who knows that town certainly would recognize it. Back when I was making that awkward transition from child to adult in the 1960s, it seemed Cliffside was the still point in a hurricane. Every morning, the Charlotte Observer brought word of the world surging out of control. Every night at 6:30, I saw the race riots, the burning cities, the hippies out in San Francisco, the anti-war rallies, the war itself. But it was all black and white, in print and on the screen. And for that reason, finally, no more real to me than the Hardy Boy mysteries I read or the adventure shows I watched on my family's decade-old zenith. This is not to say that the world outside Cliffside did not occasionally intrude. Eddie Hamrick was drafted in 1964, and Zach Merle came home one Christmas from Chapel Hill with his hair down to his shoulders and beads around his neck. But Cliffside never seemed to change. Whenever I caught myself checking the cracks in the sidewalks to make sure they weren't getting any wider, that my world was about to shatter as well, all I had to do was walk into Benson's drugstore. The candy bars were in the same place they had always been, in the same order. Butterfingers on the far left on the top shelf, then the Milky Ways, Baby Ruths, Mallow Cups, and Zero Bars. Milkshakes were 40 cents, and if Mrs. Hedrick made it, she let you take the mixing cup to the booth. If Mr. Benson made it, he kept the extra for himself. Near the water fountain were dusty postcards with a picture of Cliffside Baptist Church on the front. As far as I knew, no one had ever bought one. They were just there, and I thought they always would be, like everything else in town. Like Green's Cafe, where the best deal, the special, a cheeseburger with lettuce and tomato, French fries, and sweet tea, wasn't even listed on the menu and cost between $1.25 and $1.50, depending on Marvin Green's mood. Or McBee's Grocery, where you could always buy a Coke a nickel cheaper than anywhere else in town. Or the Co-Ed Theater, where the popcorn was as bland and almost as old as the movies. The handful who felt the town was stagnant and repressive moved to Charlotte or Atlanta. I'm old enough now to understand why some left. I'm also old enough to understand why most stayed. There was change enough in their individual lives. They're waking up every day and seeing in the mirror they were older than they'd ever dreamed they could be. Unlike the children, the adults knew even Cliffside would change eventually. But they were content to let the town drag its heels, to hold out as long as possible.
See, he can be funny. It reminded me of a story when he was in high school, and I was in junior high, and our next door neighbors had a party. It was one of the first times when there were boys and girls there. And Ron went over, and in about 20 minutes, he came running back over, and he seemed a little frantic to me, and I think it just dawned on him that there were girls at this party. And he was back over, and he was up in the bathroom, and he just couldn't figure out what to do, like he had to worry about his hair, he had to worry about his breath, he had to worry about... But what he ended up doing was putting on some JDs. I don't know how many of you remember JDs. Yeah, and JDs, it was a cologne, you could use that term loosely, but came in a little Buddha. So we had this little Buddha sitting in Boiling Springs, North Carolina. We had this little Buddha sitting, and the incongruity between Ron's frantic nature and the calm Buddha was pretty striking.
I mean, when you're about 14 or 15 and you're a male and the girls are not only light years ahead of you, in every aspect, they're so intimidating that you need something, you need, it's almost like a blessing before you go out. So you anoint yourself with this. And what Tom didn't tell you was that it was, the co-ed theater, which I did mention, the girls would have all their stale perfume of their mothers. They'd be wearing that, and we would be wearing our British Sterling, our Father's Aftershave, whatever, Aqua Velva, anything. And there was an almost visible cloud kind of wafting out over the theater. No adult would go in there. I mean, it was like, today, what's the organization that shuts down, chemical spills? EPA would have shut down the theater, I'm sure.
As far as immersing yourself, you had to remember we were Baptists. So I thought I'd have Ron talk a little bit about what it was like growing up in a small town, which was real interesting because it was a small southern town, one stoplight, still has one stoplight, but we also had a college, it was Garden Webb College at the time. It was a 2-year school when we were first moved there. And so you had the small town, you had a lot of elements that sort of mixed together in a big Baptist church too. So I thought maybe you could talk about those.
Yeah, I think looking back on my life, it was such a blessing as a writer to grow up in that environment because of the college being there, I had access to books. I would go to that library at the college. There were plays, musical events. And so I had that side of it, but at the same time, I got to grow up in I think one of the great things for a writer and growing up in a small town is that you know everyone on the social hierarchy. You know the poorest person in town, you know the wealthiest. So you really get to see that range. And also you get to see people day in and day out, and you just start to realize how strange we all are. I mean, there was a guy in town that Tom remembers that we never saw him wear a long sleeve shirt or coat. He never wore one, right? Yeah, he never. I mean, no matter, even if it was snowing, he would have a short sleeve shirt on. But the other thing that happens when you grow up in a small town is that things that you just assume are normal, once you leave, you realize they weren't. I mean, we had a guy in our town on Sunday afternoons who would pull out his lawn chair under that one stoplight and take naps. I'm glad he's here because you wouldn't believe that unless I, we had a woman who got in a snit with the preacher, and so she moved to another Baptist church, and she took her husband with her. He happened to be dead 5 years, but she dug him up and and she kept wanting him to have an absentee ballot. Well, I made that up.
There's a far cry from Serena. Well, anyway, then what happens, of course, and this happened across all small towns, the real world came crashing in the 60s, all right? And I can very vividly remember Ron's Rolling Stone magazines and how I was just started reading those things, and it was just like, where is this? You know, this is not Bowling Spring. And and so I thought I would have you read a little bit from, this is from Burning Bride, from a story that just sort of gives you a little flavor of that element.
It's called Waiting for the End of the World. So it's somewhere between Saturday night and Sunday morning clockwise, and I'm in a cinder block roadhouse called The Last Chance, and I'm playing Freebird for the 5th time tonight. But I'm not thinking of Ronnie Van Zant, but an artist dredged up from my former life, Willie Yates, and his line, "Surely some revelation is at hand." But the only rough beast slouching toward me is my rhythm guitar player, Sammy Griffin, who's down on all fours, weaving through the crowd of tables between the bathroom and stage. One of the great sins of the 60s was introducing drugs to the good old boy element of Southern society. If you were some Harvard psychology professor like Timothy Leary, drugs might well expand your consciousness. But they work just the opposite way for people like Sammy, shriveling the brain to a reptilian level of aggression and paranoia. There's no telling what Sammy snorted or swallowed in the bathroom, but his pupils have expanded to the size of dimes. He passes a table and sees a bare leg, a female leg, and grabs hold. He takes off an attached high heel and starts licking the foot. It takes about 3 seconds for a bigger foot with a steel-capped toe to swing into the back of Sammy's head like a football player kicking an extra point. Sammy curls up in a fetal position and blacks out among the peanut shells and cigarette butts. So now it's just my bass player Bobo Lingefeld, Hal Deaton, my drummer, and me. I finished Freebird, so that means the next song's from my choice. They got to have Freebird at least once an hour, Rodney said when he hired me, saying it like his clientele were diabetics needing insulin. The rest of the time you get to play what you want, he added. I turn to Bobo and Hal and play the opening chords of Gary Stewart's Roaring, and they fall in. Stewart was one of country's neglected geniuses, once dubbed Honky Tonk's white trash ambassador from hell by one of the few critics who bothered listening to him. His music's 2 centuries worth of pent-up Appalachian soul, too intense and pure for Nashville, though they tried their best to pith his brain with cocaine, put a cowboy hat on his head, and make him into another talentless Music City hack like Kid Rock, I might add. Stewart spent some of his last years hunkered down in a North Florida trailer park, no phone, not answering the door. Every window the hulk of rusting tin he called home painted black. Such a lifestyle has its appeals, especially tonight as I look out at the human wreckage filling The Last Chance. One guy has his head on the table, eyes closed, vomit drooling from his mouth. Another pulls out his false teeth and clamps them on the ear of a gal at the next table. An immense woman in a purple jumpsuit is crying while another woman screams at her. And what I'm thinking is maybe it's time to halt all human reproduction. Let God or evolution or whatever put us here in the first place start again from scratch, because this ain't working.
That leads me to ask you about
What does that lead you to?
music, your music collection, which I remember very vividly. You know, I was the younger brother, so I remember seeing the covers for Surrealistic Pillow and Abraxas and the Steve Miller Band and the Rolling Stones, and it was to the music, Jimi Hendrix, and I thought I might have you just comment on how that music played into your experience at that time. And
Yeah, well, I just think it was very important to me. I'd always grown up loving music, and you know, much of what I'd heard growing up was country and western and folk, yeah, just as I got into the 60s, I just had this sense, I hope I kind of showed in that earlier passage of this, there was so much going on outside of this little town that we were only getting You know, it's almost like getting Morse code, you know, just these little hints that something was going on. I do remember, you may not remember this, but the Shelby Star was the county newspaper, and I do remember that they actually, when I was about 16, they had an article on the bottom of the front page where a hippie had actually been sighted in Shelby. On 74. On Highway 74, you know, evidently the hippie had to get off, you know, and do something. But I mean, it was, you know, the way they would have, you know, like it was kind of like, you know, if they'd seen an albino raccoon or something. It was just something you didn't expect to see. You may not ever see one again, but one did pass through. But yeah, you know, but I always loved to listen to radio. And I remember as a you know, from about the time I was 11 or 12, I would love at night to listen to these different stations from Chicago, WLS in Chicago, and there was always this sense of this greater world that I really didn't know, but I was very curious about, and the music played into that certainly, and just that sense of. In a way, it's almost as if the world were somewhere out there and I wasn't quite in it yet. So, yeah.
Another thing you probably don't know about Ron is that he almost flunked out of high school. So, I mean, he was one of these, there's so many writers you read about who, you know, they go to high school and they're just sitting there and they're in the back and they're not really paying attention to much. But they're, you know, he was sitting back there reading Moby Dick and Faulkner and all this, and just didn't have, you know, that much interest in what was going on in front of him. But but another thing is that you were almost drafted, right?
1 year away, yeah. I got the draft number, but I was they quit the draft that next year. Right. So yeah, it was.
Yeah, I remember that. So we were sort of on watch, and you know, in our community, a lot of the the boys were sort of on watch for that kind of thing. Another thing I thought you might talk about that folks might not know a whole lot about is your running career. Ron was a very good runner. Ran in high school, set some records. Went to Brevard College, ran there. Came back to Gardner Webb, ran there, and was really running, you know, before the running boom. And would go off on these long, solitary runs. You know, he'd take off and we'd see him several hours later. And I just wondered how that running, you know, how that influenced you, how that helped your writing eventually, how it tied into your writing. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it tied in a number of ways. I'm not a well-rounded person. I'm probably the least rounded person because all my life I've only wanted to do one thing well. Actually, it was trout fishing when I was real young. Then it was running, and then it was trying to be a writer. So, but I think what running did for me was it really was valuable as a writer because it just taught me several things. One, certainly the discipline of it. There's people have, I think writing in many ways is probably the least glamorous life you can live, at least externally. I mean, it's all in your head. You're not really even moving around much. You know, just the ability to go in and make yourself write 4 or 5 hours, particularly on the days you dread it. You'd rather stick pencils in your eyes than you know, actually have to go in there. So I think the day in, the day out, the ability to, when I was a runner, to meet training in August, September for ultimately for track season in May or June. But the other thing I think is that you know, on those long runs, and I usually did work out by myself. I mean, I had to fill my head with something on those 10, 15 mile runs. You know, we didn't have the iPods or whatever. And I would just kind of daydream. And I did that even as a child a lot. I've always been very comfortable to be alone. And so I think all those things kind of tied in.
And speaking about events sort of crashing into our world, there were 2 deaths that three, but two public figures, Steve Prefontaine and Dwayne Allman, that I wanted you to talk a little bit about, because I remember, as you know, being a younger brother, how profoundly affected he was when Steve Prefontaine, who was a famous runner, and Dwayne Allman, who was a famous guitarist for the Allman Brothers, when they died. And I didn't really have a full understanding of why that had such an impact on him, but I sensed it, but didn't have a full understanding. So what exactly was going on?
Steve Prefontaine, some of you may not know who he was, but he was probably America's last truly great middle distance runner. Actually finished fourth in the Olympics when he was 21 years old in the 5,000 meters. That's very difficult to do. Probably could have gotten a silver medal, but went for the gold and ended up getting fourth. But he died at 23, and he had been my hero as a runner. And just his attitude. I had a Sports Illustrated, it said America's distance protege. I had up right above me, and I would wear, a shirt. I put Oregon on it, just trying to connect with that. So, his death really, it kind of upset me, just in the sense of seeing somebody who was on the potential of such greatness, and somebody who had spent so much of his life training, getting ready, and he was just about to that point where he was going to become that truly great runner, and he suddenly dies. And I think that the fact that he was so young too, it just kind of shook me up in the sense that you can die that young. As strong as he was, something can happen. Dwayne Allman, I think, because I'd grown up listening to so much rock and roll that was from England, from the West Coast, the Allman Brothers were such a great thing to have come out of the South at that time, because for one thing, the band was integrated. And Dwayne Allman obviously had been influenced by the blues, but the music was a great, it had country in it, some folk, some jazz, I would argue, and the rock and roll. But the thing that I think was so great about that, besides the fact that it was great music, which I still believe, was that they represented what was best in the South at a time when, at least nationally, the South was viewed in sometimes very deservedly negative way, So that, I think, yeah, and once again, a man that brilliant, dying young.
And then we had an event happen in our family. Our first cousin, Jeb, died in a single car accident. And I think that was kind of like the first, experience that we had of that. And Ron has written a poem that I'm going to have him read, and that relates to that event. And the poem is At Reed Hartley's Junkyard.
Yeah, the only time I've ever asked anyone or sent, at least brought up the possibility of being censored was I wrote a series of poems that are in my third book about Jeff's death. He was about our age. Tom and I were pallbearers, and he was 17 when he died. And his family, my aunt and uncle, they'd had just the worst luck. They were tobacco and cabbage farmers. One year when we were, 10, the barn burned down with the tobacco crop uninsured. And it was, it was just terrible. And then this tragedy occurred as well. And this is about a poem about my aunt and I going out to the junkyard where the truck is that he died in. It's called At Reed Hartley's Junkyard. To enter, we find the gap between barbed wire and briars, past the German Shepherd chained to an axle, across the ditch of oil black as a tar pit. My aunt compelled to come here on a Sunday after church, asking me when her husband refused to search this island reefed with past catastrophes. We make our way to the heart of the junkyard, cling of rust and beggar lice on our clothes, bumpers hot as a skillet, as we squeeze between car husks to find in this forever stilled traffic one Ford pickup, tires stripped, radio yanked out, driver's door open. My aunt gets in, stares through glass her son looked through the last time he knew the world. As though believing, like others who come here, she might see something to carry from this wreckage. As I will, when I look past my aunt's ruined Sunday dress, torn stockings, find her right foot pressed to the brake. So, levity, right?
Well, we're getting to our parents now, so we're back to the humor.
Yeah.
And my father and my mother were an interesting couple, and I'm going to have Ron read a couple of pieces about that somewhat pertain to them. But my father was, well, I'll let you comment on what you thought our father was. How would you talk about our father?
Oh gosh. He wasn't like the other fathers in the neighborhood. Let's start with that. The Rashes are from Lester community in this county, and my father growing up and his father, they would move back and forth from Lester, down here. They'd lived actually in Asheville a while, but they would kind of move back and forth. But anyway, when my father was about, I guess he was 16, both my grandparents were working in the cotton mill in Chester, South Carolina. And he dropped out of high school, was working there, and my mother, who'd grown up on a farm in Watauga County, had decided to come down there to look for a job. Some of our relatives from Watauga County were working in the mill. And so my parents met in this cotton mill. And so, you had these two Appalachian kids kind of, having to go down into South Carolina to meet each other. And then this remarkable story began where they decided they were going to get out of that world. My father actually went back and got a GED, continued to work a full shift and started taking night classes. He would take a bus to Columbia at night, study on the way. Eventually taught high school there and ultimately ended up at Gardner-Webb teaching at the college. My mother went back to school, ended up getting a master's. So, I think we just grew up seeing that. But my father was, he remains probably one of the three smartest people I've ever met. And I met some smart people over the years. One of them's Robert Morgan, who's right up there. But he had this brilliant mind. Yeah. He was an inventor. He created glazes. He got his master's in art. He ended up in art. So, I think we just remember him. He would love to go down into his art department and make vases. He painted some, and so. And our mother's a very talented quilter, and so I think all that was great for us because they made our lives so much easier because they worked so hard to get us to where we grew up pretty middle class. I mean, I think there were always debts because they'd gone back, but it's just I think one reason I'm really compelled to write and to use this time is that I think it's a gift that I owe my parents, because they've given me so much. And particularly my father in the sense that I think he had to give up some of his dreams as an artist just to make a living. Don't you? I mean, I think, he could have been, very easily have lived his life, a kind of bohemian life but I think he felt like he had to support his family. I do remember when I was 7, you were 4, that he dressed us up for Halloween as beatniks. And I don't think anybody knew what a beatnik was. It's kind of like that hippie, but But the other thing he did that is kind of is also amusing is he wanted to name me Rembrandt Vincent Rash, and my mother told him that you know that boy won't survive past 7 in the South with a name like that. But he did keep the Vincent, so yeah, Vincent's my middle name.
Well, why don't you read, there were two things I thought about. One is, of course, July 1949, which is a wonderful poem about the moment when my mother decides she's had enough of the mountains and she's ready to go down to South Carolina. And then a funnier passage from the story Yard of the Month, which gives you a little taste of our father. So give you a little bit of both parents.
Yeah, our mom tells this great story where she couldn't decide whether she wanted to go down to Chester or not. She was a little bit afraid to go down there, you know, growing up on that farm in Watauga County. And she actually, some relatives were going to take her, but they said they'd come by the farm and pick her up on a Saturday. And she still wasn't sure if she was going. She'd packed up her suitcase, but she still wasn't sure. So she said that day it happened to be the hottest day she could remember that summer in Watauga County. And so she was out. Her job that day was to hoe beans, and she said when that car came up the road, you know, she knew what she was going to do. And I've always wondered if it had rained that day, you know, maybe I wouldn't be wondering it. July 1949. This is what I cannot remember. A young woman stooped in a field, the hoe callousing her hands, the rows stretching out like hours. And this woman, my mother, rising to dust, rising half a mile up the road. The car she has waited days for, realized in the trembling heat. It will rust until spring, the hoe dropped at the field's edge. She is running toward the car, the sandlapper relatives who spill out coughing mountain air with lint-filled lungs. Running toward the half-filled grip she will learn to call a suitcase. She is dreaming another life, young enough to believe it can only be better. Indoor plumbing, 8-hour shifts, a man who waits unknowing for her, who cannot hear through the weave room's roar, the world's soft click, fate's tumblers falling into place. Soft is the sound of my mother's bare feet as she runs toward him, toward me. Yeah, this was called Yard of the Month, which our family never got, I might add. And in Boiling Springs, they kind of had to recycle that thing because there are only about, 55 families. So, but they never seemed to get around to us. But yeah, this is just a little bit. I just want our family, my mother said with a weary sigh, to be like everyone else's just once, just to see what it feels like. I left the bedroom and found my father having finished his Spam and crackers in the living room reading a book on Leonardo da Vinci. I knew from experience it was almost impossible to talk to him while he was reading. You could talk at him, as my mother often did, but his usual reply was either a grunt or, if she were especially insistent, an all right. An all-purpose phrase that could answer almost any question my mother would ask, from "Do you want to eat at 6:30" to "James, the house is on fire," without his having to look up from his book. A lot of truth to that. Yeah.
Our father was a classic, absent-minded professor. Classic. You know, he would wear mismatched socks and shoes and ties and purple shirts and green ties and all kinds of things. I don't know if I should tell the mouse story.
No, it's not. Yeah, we don't tell that.
But anyway, another thing.
Mouse story.
No mouse story.
No mouse story. I'll tell it individually after. Another strange thing about our family was our cars. And I thought I was going to have Ron read a little bit from a story called My Father's Cadillacs. And the point of that is that for some reason, my father, well, I think I understand why.
Yeah, we know why.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Cadillac, to own a Cadillac was very important at one point in American history. And, you know, my dad had grown up in a mill village, and I think, you know, he saw that as something, a sort of a mark that he had made it to a certain point. The only problem was that the Cadillacs were about 20 years old. And they were not, and everybody thought we were rich because we owned Cadillacs, but what they didn't realize, of course, was these cars were very, very, very old. And there was one especially that had a little story behind it.
Yeah.
That Ron
And this was the one when I was 16. And I'd say when you're 16, you just assume that your father's probably lived his whole existence just for trying to find out, how can I humiliate my son in the worst possible way? Okay, I'm gonna buy a Cadillac that not only is, you know, like 15 years old, is impossible to park, you know, and also, as you find out here, this is when the character comes into the house and finds out that they've got a new car, or newer car. The car belonged to my family. It's a Cadillac, isn't it? Like Dr. Watson's. My father proudly answered that indeed it was. My mother said nothing. It was clear she was not nearly as happy about our new car as my father was. I ran back outside. It was a Cadillac, but hardly the equal of Dr. Watson's. This one was almost 10 years old, and though it had electric windows, only 2 of ours worked. Ours had a cigarette lighter, clock, AM, FM radio. None of these accessories worked either. Nevertheless, used to the Plymouths and Mercuries, I was impressed with the fact that these gadgets had ever worked. My enthusiasm for a new car was short-lived, however. Within 3 days, Jimbo Miller, who sat behind me in homeroom, poked the back of my head with a pencil. "Why'd your old man buy that bone car?" Jimbo asked. "What are you talking about, Jimbo?" I said, knowing I really didn't want to know. "That Cadillac," he hissed, because Miss Blanton was looking our way. "Everybody in town's talking about it. That car can only come from one place. I know. When my uncle died last year, I rode in a car just like it." "Dr. Watson has a Cadillac," I said. "Yeah, but his is green. He bought his brand new, not from a funeral home. Besides, he's a doctor. I think there's some kind of law they have to drive Cadillacs."
It really was. It really was. It was black with white leather interior. If you can imagine how exotic that was at that time. And it's just an amazing thing. We still marvel over it. Another thing, to sort of switch a little bit here, one thing I was thinking about is just the role of teachers and teaching, and our parents were both teachers. We have a lot of relatives who are teachers. You teach, and your son teaches, and your daughter teaches. You've got two things going there. I wonder if you could talk about some influential teachers, and maybe talk about the fact that you've continued to teach and why you continue to teach. Talk about that for a minute.
Well, yeah, you know, I had, like everyone, the teachers that really had an impact on me really didn't come until mainly college. But I had 2 really great teachers in college, or one is an 3. I went to Garden Webb, and Joyce Brown, some of you actually Erica, you may know Joyce, a great teacher. And she was the first one that really made me feel like, well, you know, you understand literature in a way that, you know, is unusual. She felt like, you know, that I had some, whatever, perceptiveness maybe that I wasn't so sure I did have. And later, Bill Coon at Clemson, who really encouraged me. And I think in some ways, partly my fault, you know, I ended up not taking a lot of, I didn't take any gifted and talented course. I was always in a lower rung. And in a way, that maybe that wasn't so bad. I was reading, as Tom said, on my own. But I think when I saw what somebody could really do as a teacher, that really inspired me. And teaching has been very important to me. I taught 2 years of high school, I taught about 20 years at a community college, and last decade I've been at Western. And I like teaching. I mean, the only problem I had, particularly when I was at community college, was just finding the time to write, because you teach 5 classes or 6 classes a semester. It's really tough to find the energy. And I found I had to just get up real early in the morning to do it. But yeah, and you know, the fact our parents were teachers, and that I think it's a noble profession. It really is. And I feel very fortunate in that I've been able to, the jobs I've had, or careers as a writer and as a teacher, are jobs that I've never dreaded the work. And I know people who get very little joy out of their lives, out of their work lives. And I feel very blessed that I've done what I've, you know, gave me a great deal of pleasure and satisfaction.
You mentioned the importance of this area to our family, and so I thought maybe you could read a poem that talks about driving towards that area, in a sense reconnecting with that area, and it's my favorite poem by him, so with my single favorite line. So I thought I'd have to read that poem.
Yeah. We were growing up, we would go to family reunions and sometimes to church service in Leicester. And still have a lot of relatives out there. I'm actually reading there August 16th. I'm really looking forward to going back and seeing some of our connections. And actually the church there, there's a painting that my father did that is in that church. At least the last time I was there, it was still there, of Christ, that he did when he was about 17 or 18. And so it's always good to go back there. And it's also the one place, Rash is not that common a name, but around Leicester it is, Alexandria, that area, and you can actually, you know, there are just rows of Rashes in this one particular graveyard. And when my grandmother died, that's where she's buried, beside my grandfather. And one spring, I've always been a fan of John Donne. I was thinking about that, and this is called Good Friday, 1995, Driving Westward. This day I feel I live among strangers. The old blood ties beckon, so I drive west to Buncombe County, a weedy graveyard where my rare last name crumbles on stone. All were hard-shell Baptists, farmers who believed the soul is another seed that endures when flesh and blood are shed, that all things planted rise toward the sun. I dreamed them shaking dirt off strange new forms. Gathered for the last harvest, they hold hands, take their first dazed steps toward heaven.
That line, I dreamed them shaking dirt off strange new forms, did that come just in the flow of that poem, or was that a line that's always struck me as being an unusually interesting line?
Yeah, I think it's one of those lines that kind of comes as a gift sometimes, and this is something there are certain poems, certain lines in poetry that I think transcend any kind of literal meaning or they kind of defy, there's something happening with the sound in the poem that kind of just opens it up into the sublime. I felt that when I wrote that line. Yeah, somehow that just seemed right, but in a way I can't articulate. Yeah, it sounds right, and it takes. There are just lines like that we love in poetry, though we can't necessarily pin them down.
And to sort of wrap things up before we open it up for questions, was going to have Ron read from one of his newer stories. You might want to talk about your collection that's coming out. Can you
Yeah, I've got a new collection coming out in March, short stories, which is my favorite form. I think it's the most difficult to do well. It seems to me that so much of what you have to bring into a novel and so much of what you have to bring into a poem come together. But I love the form when it works. When you get somebody such as Chekhov or Flannery O'Connor who can do it so brilliantly again and again and again, it's amazing. So I'm very happy to have a new book out. And one of the stories that I wrote is actually one that kind of ties into what we've been talking about, the idea of the 60s. And this is a poem about a young girl who has been kind of hearing about this other world, and she lives right on the Blue Ridge Parkway. Our grandmother's farm in Watauga County bordered the parkway. And one of the things that I loved to do when I was a child, and some of my cousins, including Jeff, who died, and his sister, we would go up on the hill, on the pasture, my grandmother's pasture, and we would look down on the parkway. And we would play a game where we would guess which car tag. You couldn't do South Carolina, Tennessee, or North Carolina. You had to pick one. And sometimes you'd say Montana or New Mexico, and eventually all of those would come by. And once again, it was just that sense of this greater world. And this is just a start of one of the stories about a young woman who actually will be greatly affected by a car that stops with out-of-state tags. On summer Sunday afternoons, after changing out of church clothes, helping cook noon dinner, after the table was cleared and dishes washed and put away, Sabre went to the high pasture overlooking the parkway to watch the cars pass. She had done it as long as she could remember. In past years, her brother Jeffrey tagged along. They would choose any state except North Carolina and wait to see which tag went by first. Jeffrey always picked Tennessee or Florida, so he was most always one. Jeffrey had tired of the game years ago, so now Sabre went alone. A girl near 16 is too old for such nonsense, her mother had said in June. But Sabre had kept coming. Sunday afternoon was her only free time, and she'd spend it however she liked. So she actually, and then I'll read just a couple of sentences below that. Though blurry, Sabre always knew the state. Few were tricky, especially North Carolina and Tennessee, which were white with black letters and numbers, at least that year. And even then, you could make out a difference. But Sabre hardly paid those mind anyway. It was the farther away places like New Mexico or California or Alaska, whose tags had blues and golds and reds in them, that she looked for. And each time one passed, she imagined that place and what it'd be like to live there instead of a gloomy farm where days were slow as molasses. You did the same thing all week, beginning at daylight, milking a cow, and ending with the supper dishes put up.
Well, that's ready for some questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Questions?
I recently read your story in the Best American Short Stories of 2010, and I wondered, I was really anxious to know how that would end, and I was distressed at the way it ended. And I wonder how you decided how to end it.
Yeah, I assume you're talking about The Ascent.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a story about a young boy who finds a plane crash, and his home life is so horrific because of his parents being on drugs that he's not even shocked by what he finds inside the crashed plane. I think sometimes I don't want to be implacably grim, but I think I have to be true to the world of my characters. And in that story, ultimately, I think Jared, who's such a good-hearted young man, ultimately goes back and realizes that his life is unbearable, and that in a sense he knows his parents are going to die. He's smart enough and perceptive enough, and so when he goes back to the plane, I think he just gives up, and that's sad. But one thing I've tried to do, and actually in Burning Bright, we've got a real problem in the Appalachians in this area with meth. And we're not talking about it enough, I don't think. And I wanted to write 2 stories in there about meth, but they don't deal with the people using it. They deal with the effects on the parents and the child. And I think sometimes that's important. Those people are suffering. So yeah, going back to the implacably grim, I guess. But I felt like, you've got to be true to the story. I mean, sometimes people say, well, why'd you let Leonard die and the world made straight? I didn't want him to die. I really didn't. And I feel bad about it, but I do, but he had to be, you have to be true to the story and to life, sometimes to life, yeah.
It's a great story.
Well, thank you.
Your last bit before question time referred again to these bits of the outside world that appear to have haunted you or something. Did you ever go look them out, find that outside world in actual fact?
Not until, I really didn't until really the last 10, 15 years. I pretty much, I think writers, particularly Southern writers, have to decide whether to leave or to stay. I think Wayne and I decided to stay. Robert Morgan decided, and Thomas Wolfe decided they had to leave. Faulkner stayed. Welty stayed. So I think you have to make that decision. And I felt like I have to stay close to home. But I have gone. I mean, one of the great things about the writing in the last decade has been that because I am getting more of a readership outside the United States, I've been able to go to New Zealand, Australia, France. I'm going to Denmark in September. So I'm getting to know some of that wider world. I think I got to know it through literature, certainly. Some of my favorite novelists are Russian. Always felt an affinity to their work. So yeah, in that way, I think I've learned.
Can I ask a supplement? When you did go out into the world, did you feel much influenced by that, by your experiences out there, or to write? I mean, as a writer, did you have to come back? And most of your writing does concern this area, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So I suppose the broad question is, how much does a writer need to be where his roots are?
Well, I think I think for different writers it's different. I think, as I say, someone such as Robert Morgan, who's from this area, felt like to be outside of it, you really get a perspective that is very valuable. I think that's true. But once again, I mean, you think of someone such as, like I say, Faulkner, pretty much decided to stay home. I mean, I'd traveled some, but I think I felt like what I needed to do as a writer, I could do here. And I needed to, almost, I had to be in that world to write about it. I had to feel it. I had to see the mountains to write about it. And, I hope that was the right decision. It feels right. It feels right, yeah.
Well, I think this may be more of a comment than a question, but Thomas Wolfe said that he wrote to forget, didn't he? I mean, it's a different thing why people write, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But I just want to say that the Ascent, which is just 9 pages long, is, I think, one of the finest pieces of literature I've ever read.
Well, thank you. That's a plant.
No, we voted in our class, and it didn't win.
Okay, well.
That's my view. I really think that is, every word in it is the perfect word. And I had to almost ask myself why this is not called The Descent rather than The Ascent.
Well.
And then I thought about Carlos Williams. His the descent back as the Ascent, and I just thought it was really wonderful. I hope everybody in here who hasn't read it. And it is definitely dark, but it's a wonderful story.
That's one of your favorites. And Tom's probably my most discerning reader, so yeah. He likes it.
I have a question. I understand that writers usually base a lot of their characters' story on personal experiences and how they grew up. So, where did you get the character of Serena?
Well, actually, I tend not to be an autobiographical writer as far as novels. I mean, obviously, part of me, compulsions, whatever, neuroses come through. I never met anyone like her, and I'm glad. But what happened was that stories come to me in images, and I just had this image of a woman on horseback, and I knew that she was intimidating. I knew that she was resourceful, and she just kind of emerged. And I think that's the part, as a novelist, that these characters seem to just sometimes they just come. I mean, it's almost like people who walk into your life, and you have to run with them and stay with them. But it's been interesting with her. To me, she's a character unlike any I've ever written, for one thing. Where she came from, I don't know. But I do know that novel was the most intense writing experience of my life. I went deeper into a place, and I mean, in a way, almost a scary place. I was really, I've never been that deeply into a book. And there were a couple of times I was hoping I would come out, and I wasn't so sure. But I did get a great story out of it when I did a reading in Washington, or a book signing. A guy came up to me and he said, "I'm gonna buy your book, but you gotta sign it exactly the way you want me. I want you to." And I said, "Well, okay." I think I can do that. And so he said, "All right, for Mary Ann, this book," he did this kind of slowly, this book is about the only woman meaner than you. And to this day, I have no idea who she was, but, ex-wife, mother-in-law, whatever. But I said, okay, when I wrote that, and I said, but you put your name first. So I kind of put mine down at the bottom of the page. So at least I got a good story out of it.
Yes, I really like your short stories, and I wonder where you get the ideas. They're so unique and sharp, and the stories like Dead Confederates seem very bright.
Yeah. Sometimes I'll hear something that'll trigger a story. Actually, with The Ascent, I'd read a newspaper column that said a Cessna, small airplane had been lost in the I think it was the Pisgah Forest for 6 years, and a bear hunter found it. And I remember cutting that out and just keeping it on my bureau for 3 years until the story came. The Dead Confederate story, I think I knew that that kind of memorabilia sold for a good price, and I was actually thinking about, what would a real scoundrel, how would, a real scoundrel deal with that? So, yeah, I'm not trying to the stories just kind of come. I mean, sometimes they come from reading, from something I remember, but sometimes they just seem to, I think Wayne would agree with this, maybe not, but I feel sometimes almost as if what writers are, it's not so much that they're imagining these or creating these things, it's almost like the stories are out there somewhere in the ether, and what writers do is they kind of tap into them. I mean, it's almost like a radar or transistor and, a tower, radio tower, and you happen to hit it and get the signal. And And I, you know, that always sounds crazy, I think, but a lot of writers I know, and one of the scariest things I've ever been told, maybe the most unsettling thing anyone's ever asked or told me about my books, was I had a woman call me at Western one day, and she had read The World Made Straight, which deals with a Civil War massacre in Madison County, and she said, she was talking a little bit about the story. She said, "Do you know where your stories come from?" And I said, "Well, you know, I really don't a lot of the time." And she said, "They're the stories the dead want told." And I don't know if I'm glad she told me that or not, but that, I mean, sometimes it's as I say, it's almost kind of like they're kind of out there. And, you know, and obviously some of them come from, you know, you read a lot and you play off a story that somebody else wrote. I mean, there are conscious parts of this as well, but the older I get, the more mysterious the whole process is, and I think that's not a bad thing. You know, it just happens, and you want it to happen. You hope it happens again. Yeah.
I have a question, Ron. Of all of your writings, do you have a favorite?
Oh, wow. You mean of everything? Everything. Wow.
Or you could break it down into novels, short stories.
Yeah. I think Serena is, you know, to me that's the book, maybe because, as I said, I just kind of went into this deeper place, and I feel like she's a character that there's, you know, not a lot of precedence for, at least in American literature. So to me that was very satisfying, and that I was able to make a big book. That'll be, you know, that'll be, for me, you know, about 400 pages. That's by far my longest novel. I think that's probably the one if I had to pick, yeah.
I was with a group the other day, we were talking about you and your writing. And we were also talking about Serena and the fact that they're going to make a picture of it, or maybe they already are making it. Can you tell us about who's in it, or do you know any more details about that?
Well, of course, where do you film Appalachian movies? Either Romania or the Czech Republic. You know, Charles's Cold Mountain they did in Romania, right? Romania. So and they filmed. Actually, they finished the filming. They did it in Czech Republic. But the people involved, I mean, I haven't seen it, I hadn't even read the screenplay. I've just deliberately stayed away from it. You know, there's nothing good that can come out of my being involved in it in any way. But I do know Suzanne Bier is a great director. She did In a Better World. If you know her work, she's Danish. I think she'll do it. You know, I feel good about her. Jennifer Lawrence is playing Serena, and she's young. But if you saw Winter's Bone, which I think is a more impressive performance than Hunger Games, you just get the sense that she has the physicality to play Serena. Bradley Cooper is playing Pemberton. Really good character actor Toby Jones, who was in Infamous. He played Truman Capote. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Is playing the sheriff, and Rhys Ifans is playing Galloway. So, yeah.
Ron, you have stated on several occasions that your novels begin with a vision, and we know that Serena began with the vision of the woman on the horse. In the Cove, you also talk about the vision of, and I'm trying to remember, a man under a bush with a musical instrument?
Yeah, playing a flute. Yeah.
Yes. And what I would like to know is, what vision do you have in your head now that's going to become your next novel?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have one. I finished up this story collection, and it's actually for about I did my final edits on it about 3 weeks ago, and right now I'm between. I don't have anything going. I'm just kind of waiting. Actually, it's funny. I turned off the radio when I was driving over here and this morning, and I'm just kind of waiting to see if something came. Ended up turning on, the radio back on. and the Bee Gees came on, which I took as a bad sign. Maybe it ain't happening today.
I have a question about your process. When you're working on something, do you just work on that thing? Because you work in so many mediums, do you work every day, and when you're working on it, do you just do this novel, or do you just do poems?
I tend to do one. What I do, though, I haven't written much poetry in the last decade. I've been pretty much writing stories or novels, and what I tend to do is I'll write, I usually do about 12 drafts of my novel, so I'll do a draft of a novel, and then just to get away from it, I will write a story, then I'll do another draft of the novel, then I'll, maybe write a story or two, and so I kind of use that, I kind of pace it that way. Sometimes when I'm working on a novel, a story will come, and I'm afraid I'll lose it if I don't get to it, so I'll stop. But yeah, you just, you just move from whatever, to whatever you feel like you need to do. And the part I hate the most is first drafts. So if I can get a first draft of something, I feel like the hardest part's over. And, but like, that's when I get worried. I've got to get that first draft down, particularly for a story. So if I'm in the middle of revising a novel and a story comes, I'll take a couple of days to at least get, a very, very rough draft of the story, and then I can go back.
You mentioned the idea of myth, and when you wrote about your mom, you talked about fates, tumblers falling into place, and in your novels, what is the role of fate? Inescapable, or just logically driven to the end, or something else?
I think I would tie that, I think in a sense, one thing that, particularly in the Cove, I'm very interested in is the idea of landscape as destiny and the impact of where you're born. I mean, the geography as much as the social status. What does it do to you to be born in mountains as opposed to the seacoast? And so yeah, I think in a way, particularly in the Cove, I wanted that novel to be a novel where, in a sense, at least on one level, the landscape was fate, was destiny, and that to me, in that novel, and a lot of readers I don't think feel this way, so maybe I failed, but I think Laurel, I don't want to give away too much about the novel, but I think she achieves a victory of imagination in that novel, because when she's able to imagine that ship, she's able to transcend that landscape, that fate that she's been dealt through the imagination. And I think there's something heroic about what she achieves there.
When we're up on the Blue Ridge and you take a look out, you see nothing but trees for 50, 60 miles around us. But when you read Serena, and I know you researched that so thoroughly, what would the landscape have looked like at that time?
It would have looked like, including right around here, places such as Mount Mitchell, it would look like those mountains had been scalped. I mean, parts of the Smokies would have been, Wayne knows this. And one reason I wrote Serena, I really wrote that novel as much about today as the past, because to me, I hope one thing that book does is remind you how easily lost something like this can be. Because when I was working on Serena, there was a real strong effort to actually allow some really intense timbering in national parks at that time. And so, yeah, I mean, it would have looked like a moonscape almost. It's so, it's so, not funny, but it's interesting. Sometimes people will go into the Smokies and they think they're seeing virgin forest. No, they're not. It's all been cut at least once. And, but, it's grown back and it's beautiful now, and I'd hate to see us lose it again. Yeah. I think we've...
Thank you. You're a writer, but I've
feel you're primarily a storyteller. What's the kernel of storytelling?
I would say, at least from the storytellers I know, knowing what to put in, what to put out, pacing, the telling detail that opens a story up, sometimes just a very minor story that allows the story to, almost like a photography flash, that suddenly the whole place is illuminated. That's the best quick answer. And probably a good one to end on, I think. Yeah.
I don't know when I have, on a Sunday afternoon, laughed more or wanted to cry more. I don't know about your success as a trout fisher or a runner, but I think we can all swear to your success as a writer.
Well, thank you.